Hi, we're going to get started. I'm Elizabeth Donahue. I run Public and External Affairs here at the school. And welcome to today's talk, which is Education's Technology Future. Today's guest speaker is Daphne Koller, who is the co-founder of the online platform Coursera, which, believe it or not, if you've seen this in the news and heard about it, only launched last April. So it's pretty astounding how much this online platform has caught on. And I think Daphne said no one's as surprised as she is by her current schedule and the popularity and embrace that this has had. It is at Princeton. Clayton Marsh, who will join us for the Q&A after Daphne's talk, was instrumental in bringing it to Princeton and piloting some of the courses that are using Coursera. And I can see we have a couple people in the audience, professors in the audience, who are teaching these courses, so I hope they chime in during the Q&A as well. We're going to end a little early tonight at 5:40, so we're going to have a talk, and then I hope you have good questions. And I just want to say this is part of our technology series, and we had the idea, it's a little different than some of our usual public talks, but it really is an important piece of education policy going forward and how it affects not only the Princetons of the world, but our community colleges and whatnot. So online learning is a thing I think that's here to stay, and piecing through all the policy implications is important for our school to do. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. The title of this talk is The Online Revolution, Education for Everyone, and I'm going to start by motivating the education for everyone, spend most of the talk on the online revolution, and come back to the importance of education for everyone at the very end of the talk. So, helps if you turn these on. So, why should we offer education for everyone? There's currently this tremendous hunger in the world for high quality education that in many parts of the world is just not achievable. So one of those places where education is unachievable is in many parts of the developing world, including in Africa, where capacity is just not there for the people who would like to be educated in public institutions. So in many of the public institutions in Africa, the admit rate is about 1 in 8 from among the qualified applicants. And that gives rise to tragedies such as the one that occurred in January of this year in South Africa, where in the University of Johannesburg, there were a handful of slots left open in the standard admissions process. And the day before they were going to reopen those slots for general admissions, there was a line of people literally a mile long outside the gate wanting to be first in line to get one of those highly desirable positions. And when the gates opened in the morning, there was a stampede, and 20 people were badly injured, and 1 woman died. She was the mother of a son, and in some ways you can say that she literally died to try and give her son a chance at a better life. This is a particular tragedy, but it's not atypical of a lot of the situation in the developing world. 3 weeks ago, I happened to be in New York for the launch of the United Nations Education First initiative, whose goal is by 2015 to provide an education to every child around the world. And Gordon Brown, who was speaking, he's the UN Special Envoy for Education, was talking about his travels in Africa and how people who live on a cup of food a day, you ask them what it is that they want the most, and they don't say more food, they don't say better shelter, they say a better education for their children. Because education is the great democratizer, and it is the way in which people can build a better life for themselves. If we move closer to home, the situation obviously is much better, but there's still issues in terms of access to education. There's been a lot of talk about, for example, so here what you see over here is a graph of the increase in different goods from 1985 on the left all the way to 2011. And so you see gas wobbling up and down but increasing. At the very top of the graph, there is medical care where you would expect it to be because everyone talks about the rising cost of medical care. What until recently has not been quite as familiar to people is the fact that college tuition and fees are rising at almost twice the rate of medical care. Now, a lot of that, to be fair, is due to the increase in, the decrease in state subsidies for a lot of the state institutions, and that's what's causing a lot of tuition increases. But nevertheless, even if you factor that in, or for whatever reason, the cost to the consumer, to the student of their education is rising to the point that it becomes out of reach for a lot of people. So this is sort of the problem that you would like to solve, is you would like to provide education to everyone. And this is one of my favorite quotes. This is Tom Friedman, when he wrote up about this effort in the New York Times in May, put it better than anyone else had before or since. And he basically said the big breakthroughs are what happens when what is suddenly possible meets what is desperately necessary. The desperately necessary were the first two slides. The suddenly possible were the 3 Stanford classes that launched almost exactly a year ago today, in October of 2011, that really demonstrated that it is possible to offer a high-quality education at scale to hundreds of thousands of people. So these were 3 fairly advanced computer science classes that were made available to the world, and each of them had an enrollment of 100,000 students or more. So to put that number in perspective, my colleague and co-founder Andrew Ng teaches a class at Stanford that's one of the bigger Stanford classes. It has an enrollment of about 400 students each time it's taught, which is pretty impressive for an advanced computer science class. When Andrew taught the machine learning class to the general public, he had 100,000 students, which if you do the math, it means that to reach that same size audience, Andrew would have to teach his Stanford class for 250 years. So this is, I think, what indicated that this was really possible to offer education to this number of people and provide them with a high-quality experience. And that's really what caused us to sort of embark upon this path that we're on today. And let me just give you a brief summary of where we are today before I move into some of the technical details. So we are fortunate enough to have partnered with 33 of the world's best institutions. Princeton was one of our very first partners, and that's a true privilege for us. Here you can see a number of others have followed that path that was laid by Princeton, Stanford, Penn, and Michigan, who were our first 4 partners back in April. Universities are not the only ones that are interested in participating in this. Even more, I think, exciting perhaps is the interest and participation on behalf of students. So what you see here is 2 graphs. There's a blue graph, which is the growth in student enrollments. That is number of students who are taking classes on this platform. On April 18th, when we launched, we had somewhat less than 200,000 students who were kind of left over from some older classes. We hit 1 million users on August 9th. 6 weeks later, we were at 1.5 million. It's rising pretty steadily at about 70,000 new users every week. The graph at the top, the red graph, is the enrollments, that is course enrollments, which is a higher graph because students typically enroll for 2 or 3 classes. We hit 5 million enrollments the same week that we hit 1.5 million students. Now, I think this is a testament to 2 things, to the hunger for education that you see, and to the quality of the courses that working with universities such as Princeton were able to offer these students. So let me talk about the elements that make up this course experience. The first is video-based instruction. So, and there's a missing slide. Sorry, where did my slide go? It moved. My slide moved. It moved badly. Sorry, no, it just got hidden. I'm going to unhide it. Sorry, this is an important slide. Okay, this is the overview slide. My apologies. So what made these courses so different? What are the different elements that I'm about to talk about? The big difference between this and previous efforts, like, for example, MIT's OpenCourseWare effort, which was a seminal effort back in 2001 of putting course content available to the world, is that this is not a set of static content. This is a real course. So the course begins on a given day, And then every week, just like in a real college class, material gets released, like videos, and there's a homework. And the homework is graded. And if you don't do your homework, you don't get a grade. And that's important to people, these weekly deadlines. And you can see that in the usage graph on the website. You see these spikes? These spikes are deadlines. Every week before the deadline, there's a spike in the usage. And that indicates that procrastination is really a global phenomenon. And at the very end of this, there is a reward, just like in a college class. Students who complete the class get something meaningful at the end. In many of our classes, they get a certificate, which they can then present to an employer that would make them, that would allow them potentially a chance at a better job. And that reward is meaningful to people, and it keeps them going, and also is part of the impact of this class. So let's talk about the different pieces of this. The first is video-based instruction. So one of the things that you get here is that by teaching a course, one of the lessons that we've learned is that it's important not to view an online course as simply taking your on-campus physical course and just transmitting it into this new medium in exactly the same form, because then you lose the stuff, a lot of the stuff that made the class successful as a face-to-face class, without gaining any of the new and interesting things that you can from moving to a new medium. So what can you gain by moving to video as a primary medium? First, you get the ability for students to traverse the curriculum at their own rate and in a way that makes sense for their own learning style. So let me show you an example of what the experience looks like for a student as they're taking a class. This is a short snippet of a video.
And generally, we will start with some set of players as an accepted starting point.
So you can see it's going to 1.5 speed.
So what are the possible actions that each player can take?
You can watch with subtitles
Passive and active, enough of
in different languages.
the details of what's going on in their brain relationship. Well,
So students can watch at their own pace. They can watch quickly if they're getting this. They can pause and rewind if they aren't. The subtitles help them keep on track. They also are very valuable for students with hearing and learning disabilities. And you can see that because we have translations, which by the way are crowdsourced by students in the class, those translations are also very helpful for foreign language students who are therefore also able to benefit from the material. So this is to be contrasted with a standard lecture where the instructor has to pick a median point of their pace, which might be too fast for some students and too slow for others, and just stick to it because there's no choice. The other aspect of personalization that you get by moving to a video medium is that you don't have to stick with the 75-minute constraint or 50-minute constraint that are imposed on us by classroom scheduling. So you can break down the video into short modules that make sense from a pedagogical perspective, so 8 to 12-minute videos. And then each of those is a coherent concept which the student can, again, traverse in a way that makes sense for them. And you can now add additional material, for example, review material that might be necessary for some students, but maybe not for everyone, or optional material that might be useful for some students or of interest to some students, but perhaps not everyone in the class. And this personalization of the curriculum allows us to break away from the one-size-fits-all model of education that has been forced on us by the need to scale our teaching to a large lecture class. So that's the first piece of it, but I think as educators, the important thing that we learn is that the lecture is only a very small part of the learning process. A much bigger part is the ability for students to interact with the material, practice with it, and achieve mastery. So we've put in interaction into the material in a variety of different places. So for example, here is interaction within the lecture.
Four things: prospect theory, hyperbolic discounting, status quo bias, base rate bias. They're all well documented.
When the video hits that yellow notch, it pauses and the students get asked a question, which they answer, and are given immediate feedback as to whether this is right or wrong. In this case, it was wrong. So the students get to try again. This time the student gets it right, and there's an optional explanation. Now these are simple questions, the ones that as an instructor you might ask of the students in your class. But when you do that, 80% of the students are still scribbling the last thing you said. There's the ones that are sitting at the back that are all on Facebook or buying shoes, as Mitch told me the other day. And then there's the smarty pants in the front row who answers the question typically before most of the classes even notice that a question has been asked. And then the class moves on before the vast majority of the students have even engaged with a question. Here, every student has to engage with the material, which is really important for retention of the material. It's important for engagement. And it's really something that the students get a lot out of because, to be honest, it gives them a little dopamine rush. It's like, yes, I'm getting this. I want to continue. And so it's a really important part of the interaction. Now, of course, these little baby questions in the middle of the video are not the real homeworks that I told you about that caused the spike in traffic. So in addition, every week, there is meaningful work that the students have to do that provide an in-depth assessment of the learning. Now, this is a challenge, of course. It's probably one of the biggest challenges for an instructor in these courses because when you have 100,000 students, usually your institution is not going to fund 5,000 teaching assistants. So I don't know about Princeton and Stanford, that doesn't seem to happen. So how do you grade at scale the work of 100,000 or 50,000 students? So obviously there's multiple choice, that's fairly generic. I've already shown you the kind of short answer questions that allow you to do some syntactic pattern matching on a string, which is nevertheless, although simple, a much more useful pedagogical tool than picking things from among lists because it calls for active retrieval of the content. We have fairly sophisticated grading for math expressions that allow a math expression to be graded in a way that doesn't look for just syntactic identity, but rather semantic equivalence of the math expression to another one. So it would know, for example, that 0.5 times x is the same as x squared over 2, without the instructor having to specify all of the infinitely many variations that are all correct answers to that mathematical question. We have extensive grading for different types of structured data, whether it's grading of an Excel spreadsheet that might be a marketing model, a financial model, data analysis, and so on, as well as grading for computer programs that are also provide a certain structured output. And you can do some fairly sophisticated grading of computer programs, not just for correctness, which is pretty easy. Does the program produce the same output that the instructor said it ought to produce, but also graded on performance. So for example, one of my assignments in my class is action recognition from the 3D Kinect sensor. So the students are supposed to write a program that determines whether the person is waving or clapping or doing jumping jacks or whatever, and they're graded on how well they recognize whether what the correct actions are, as opposed to can they replicate exactly the functionality that the TA's program generated. So let me show you one of the programming assignments. This is in the Stanford Computer Science 101 class. The students are supposed to write a program that color corrects this image, which I don't know if you can see because of the light, but you can see that this is not particularly well color corrected. So the students can try again. Again, they press submit, and this time they're told that their output is correct. And so again, it provides the students with an opportunity to obtain immediate feedback about their work and therefore obtain mastery in the material before moving on, and I'll come back to that. Now, that, of course, is all very well, but when we went and talked to universities such as Princeton all the way back in February and March, and told them about all this great auto-grading capability that we'd built in, the response that we got from people in the humanities and social sciences, like Mitch here, for example, is that this is all very well, but you can't really, math is not particularly useful for them in their homeworks, and programming assignments definitely not, and so really that leaves us with multiple choice. And for obvious reasons, they were understandably reluctant to use multiple choice as the primary form of grading of the material. And so we had to come up with something else. And so one of the biggest developments that we put in place during the spring is the ability to use peer grading to grade the kind of open-ended essay-style work that is so necessary in disciplines in the humanities, for example, and the social sciences. And then we discovered, perhaps not surprisingly, that once that capability was in there, a good number of the engineering faculty also wanted to be able to grade open-ended critical thinking style works. Now, a lot of people outside of these disciplines are also using it. So what is this? The idea is that you're using students in the class to grade the work of other students in the class. an exercise called peer grading, which had been applied successfully by a variety of educational researchers in the context of small classes with significant instructor control on the peer grading process. So here is a study by Sadler and Good from 2006. These are not our data, these are older data. And you can see on the x-axis the teacher grade, on the y-axis there's the student grade, and you can see a very nice correlation between the peer grades and the teacher grades. They also showed, perhaps even more surprisingly, that if the students are appropriately incentivized to critically assess their own work, then the correlation between the teacher grades and the student grade becomes even greater. What they also showed, which I think is perhaps even more exciting, is that these also improved learning outcomes for students who were involved in these activities. That is, the process of critically thinking about other students' work and your own work actually allowed you to do better in understanding the material for the class. Now, this is all very well, but it was done only in these very small and well-controlled settings. No one had done this kind of peer grading experiment on the scale of thousands of students. And in order to apply that technology to this type of framework, we had to come up with a few other ideas, which we sort of co-opted from the area of crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing is this thing that's used to run Wikipedia and a variety of other places where you're using the knowledge of a crowd of less expert people in order to produce a more expert answer. And so we developed this peer grading pipeline, which I'm not sure how well you can see from the back, but let me just take you through some of the major steps in this. This is the pipeline as a whole. Not everyone has implemented all of it. But what is done here is that the students submit the assignments at the deadline. And then, and this is really critical, they are given a grading rubric, which is a very carefully written, detailed description of what it is they ought to look for in the work of their peers. What are the factors that they ought to be looking for? And for each factor, what is a 1, what is a 3, and what is a 5? And given that rubric, then there is this calibration phase, where students are given work to grade that the instructor had previously graded, and they are asked to grade that without being told the instructor's grades, and then the system compares their grades to the instructor grades, and if they're within ballpark, then they're declared competent to apply the rubric to the work of others, and if not, they're asked to go ahead and grade another piece of work. And I think that really helps the robustness of the grading process. So having done this calibration phase, which is listed as 2 over there, they can go ahead and peer grade the work of others. We have each piece of work being graded by 5 students, so that it gives you a more robust answer than if only a single student who might be an outlier or not paying attention or whatever would be grading each piece of work, and that's important. And then with that, the students have the option of potentially grading their own work, and also potentially seeing the grades that other people gave to the work that they graded themselves, so that they can compare how calibrated they are with the opinion of their peers. And all of these are actually really valuable learning experiences for the students. And we can consistently hear on the discussion forums how much students enjoy and appreciate the peer grading opportunity. So in Mitch's class, for example, which was the second one to launch with peer grading, and the first in the humanities to launch with peer grading, we actually kept the peer grading process open an extra 24 hours, not because the students didn't finish their peer grading assignment, because they wanted to continue grading more stuff, which was a pretty cool thing to see. Okay, so here is just an example of what one of these grading rubrics looks like, and I think you can't really read the text from the back, and you're not supposed to. The important thing to see here is just that each student gets not only a quantitative score, which is the aggregate of the scores that they got from their peers, but also qualitative feedback from 5 different people, so it's kind of formative feedback explaining why things work and what they didn't do right. So here are some very preliminary results from peer grading from the very first class to launch with peer grading, the human-computer interaction class at Stanford. The results are, you see the distribution of the peer grade minus the staff grade. So what you'd like to see is a single huge spike at 0, which you don't exactly see. The green spike are scores that are within 5% tolerance of the grade. The red spikes that are next to them are within 10%. So overall it's about 60% of the peer grade scores are within 10% of what you would like to see as the teacher grade. Now, this is good. It's not amazing. we think we can do better. And one indication that we might be able to do better is derived from this following graph over here. These are these are 4 of the 5 assignments in the Stanford HCI class, assignments 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the 0 line in the middle of each of them is where the peer grade and the staff grade are the same. So what you'd like to see is this thick bar at 0. Now, if you look at assignments 2 and 3, you don't see anything that looks remotely like a thick bar at 0. You see a very broad spread around that thick bar, around the 0 line. But as you get to assignments 4 and 5, the bar gets tighter and tighter to the point where in assignment 5, it actually looks very much like a thick line at 0. Now, there's multiple explanations as to why peer grading performance improves over the course of the different assignments. One argument is that the bad students just dropped the class and they were the ones who couldn't grade. That's possible. A second is that students just learned how to apply peer grading over the course of time, and so they became more skilled at it. That's also possible. Then the third assignment, and the third reason, which I actually think is definitely also true, is that we learned how to construct better grading rubrics. Because it turns out that how you write a grading rubric is really critical to the success of this. And a bad grading rubric gives you results that look like that, no matter what the student population looks like. And so we think that there's reason to believe that by training students better and by writing better grading rubrics, we can get closer to that distribution on the right, which would give us a much tighter distribution than what you saw on the previous slide. So that's sort of where we hope to go with this. So anyway, by putting all of these different techniques together, we can now offer courses across a fairly impressive range of disciplines. There's 17 or 18 different topics in courses that we have that range from the more technical ones like computer science. We have physical sciences. There's a 3-course astronomy sequence from 3 different institutions, a 3-course neuroscience sequence from 3 different institutions. We have 30-some humanities courses, including Mitch, who will tell me that it's not exactly humanities class, but it's close. And a range, we have a performance music class of a 6-time Grammy Award winner who's teaching improv jazz using peer grading. So a really broad range of courses that can be accommodated in this way. And the other nice thing is that initially when we came into this, we thought, perhaps foolishly, that the classes that would have the high enrollments would be the ones that had concrete career benefits to the students taking them. So finance, machine learning, algorithms, and so on. Those indeed have high enrollments, but what we've discovered is that classes that really seems that their primary purpose is not to provide better job prospects, but simply to expand the mind, are getting high enrollments as well. And some of our highest enrollment classes are, for example, Jeremy Edelman's world history class here at Princeton, a philosophy class from Duke, the music class, and many others. Okay, the final piece of the puzzle is the community. So one of the side effects, desired side effects of the fact that the class is semi-synchronized so that everyone starts on a different day is that it generates a community of learners that are all doing effectively the same thing at the same time. Not exactly the same time, but in the same week. So that gives us a global community of learners that really spans the world, that are all looking at the material together. So here is just, these are just pretty screenshots of little points of light of a particular point in, I think it was in the evening, where people happened to be logged in onto the platform at that point in time. So here's the United States, Europe, Asia. When you have 1.6 million students, there is an awful lot of people logged in at any given point in time. Now, what does this global community do? Well, first of all, it avoids the real bottleneck that we can never scale up, which is instructor time. Instructor time is needed in a normal class to answer student questions, but you can't scale that up to 100,000 students. But you can, when you have enough students who are willing to help answer each other's questions, that does in fact scale. And so what we see here is our discussion forum, where students are asking questions and other students are answering each other's questions. And this is one of those counterintuitive points where having more students is actually helpful as opposed to having fewer, because if you ask a question even at 3 o'clock in the morning, somewhere around the world, someone's going to be up and looking at the discussion forum. So the median response time for questions on the discussion forum was something like 22 minutes, which is not a level of service that I've ever given to my Stanford students. And so this really gave students in many cases, a very detailed and thoughtful response to their questions and allowed them to stick through the hard bits. In addition, in this latest generation of courses, we've expanded beyond that. So we've introduced the notion of a community TA. Community TAs are people who took a previous incarnation of the class and did well in it. Did well both in terms of scoring highly, but also equally importantly in terms of being active members of the discussion forum, and so demonstrating a willingness to help. And we reached out to those students and asked them, do you want to volunteer to help your fellow students? So we did this in my class. We reached out to about 40 students. We got 19 who said that they would do this, so about a 50% response rate. And they're doing an amazing job of answering questions, holding virtual office hours. They're even fixing bugs in my programming assignments, which is really an amazing sort of community effort. And they're doing it for two reasons. Some of it are doing it because they want to give something back. And others have come and told us that they're learning the material so much better by having to explain it to other people. Now, a final form of interaction happens in this thing that grew organically, which is study groups. People just started posting on the discussion forum saying, hey, I'm here in Guadalajara and I want to form a study group for this and this class. Who wants to join me? I'm going to be in this coffee shop on Monday afternoon. And we see that there's physical study groups of people meeting in coffee shops or in somebody's house. There's also virtual study groups like Russian-speaking students. And there's even a multilingual universal study group of people who explicitly want to connect with people from other languages and other cultures. And right now, if you look on Meetup, where these communities are now forming, we have about 1,500 different communities in over 1,300 different cities meeting regularly to discuss these courses, which is, so people really just getting together around this intellectually challenging activity. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit at the end about some of the cool things that one can think of going forward. The first is the amazing data that is being collected as part of this effort, because one of the things that you do here is that you measure every single event on every single student, where they pause, where they rewind, where they go to 1.5 speed, which questions did they answer first, and what answers did they give, and what answers did they give if they came back the second time. And all of these are measured and stored in the system at a scale of 50,000 students. So that allows you to start answering questions that up until now you just could not have even begun to ask relative to existing data sets. So here's one such example. This is from Andrew's machine learning class. It's a distribution of student wrong answers to one of the questions. The answers happen to be pairs of numbers, which is why you can draw them on a grid. And each little dot is a one-off wrong answer. It's some bizarre error that some student came up with. But the big crosses are ones where lots of students came up with the exact same wrong answer. So the big cross at the top left is 2,000 students that came up with the exact same wrong answer. Now, if you have 100 students, and if you have a class of 100 of which 2 come up with the same wrong answer, you're never going to notice. But when 2,000 people make the exact same mistake in what is a continuum of different possibilities, that kind of jumps out at you. And so Andrew and his TAs looked at what was going on, understood the basis for the misconception, and basically constructed it so that any answer that fell into that bucket, instead of just the student getting the "you're wrong" response, they were getting a targeted response that sent them off in the right direction to fix their mistake. And so there's a personalization of the learning experience to the needs of these students. You can ask even deeper questions, and we've now started to do that. So for example, if a student submits an incorrect answer to a question, and then eventually they finally submit a correct answer to a question, what did they do in the middle? What was it that they did in that span that they didn't do in the first span that was most likely to transition them to the right answer? So you can ask that about watching lectures or about visits to the discussion forum. And so you can identify, for example, which threads in the discussion forum are most likely to correct students' misconceptions. And when you do that, you can now go and tell the teacher, maybe you should have explained that better the first time. Or you might tell the students who fall into this kind of error mode that you see over here that they might want to go look at this forum post because it might be helpful to them in correcting their mistake. So you can really start helping both the students and the instructors do better. Okay. Which brings us to the improvement of learning outcomes. And that happens, I think, in two different places, or could happen in two different places. The first is by providing potentially the start of a solution to a 30-year-old problem. In 1984, renowned educational researcher Benjamin Bloom wrote a paper called the 2 sigma problem. In that paper, Benjamin Bloom graphed the distribution of achievement scores in 3 populations. The blue curve that you see here is the students who were taught in a traditional lecture, about 30 students in that lecture. So this is a distribution, a histogram of achievement scores. The red curve is students who were taught in a lecture-based format, but in a mastery learning form. That is, they couldn't move on to the next topic before achieving mastery in the previous one, giving them a much better basis for their learning. The final green curve are the students who were lucky enough to have access to individual human tutoring, so one-on-one tutoring. And you can see that the red curve is significantly to the right, in fact, a full standard deviation, or sigma, to the right of the blue curve, and the green curve is 2 sigma, or 2 standard deviations to the right of the red curve. Now, in terms of understanding what that means, if you take the blue population, the lecture-based population, you define that midpoint of the achievement, the median, as a threshold. So half the students in that group are going to be above, and half the students are going to be below. If you use that same threshold as a notion of achievement, in the green population, 98% of the students are going to be above that point. So if you go to the Lake Wobegon way of thinking about this, it says that 98% of your students are above average. Hence the 2 sigma problem, because as Benjamin Bloom pointed out, as a society, we can't afford to provide a human tutor for every single student. But maybe now we can provide a laptop or at least a tablet or smartphone to every single student. And if we do that, the question now becomes, can technology move us from the blue curve to the red curve and ultimately closer to the green curve? Now, the red curve seems well within reach, because the nice thing about computers is that they don't get bored, unlike a human tutor or instructor, from explaining the same concept for the 5th time, nor do they get tired of grading the same homework for the 3rd time. And so you're able to give students a chance to achieve mastery before they move on. The personalization that an individual human tutor gives you is more challenging, but we've already seen bits and pieces of that in some of the work that I've mentioned. The ability to give students individualized feedback on what they're getting wrong, and the fact that they can learn at their own pace instead of being forced into a lockstep with everybody else. And so it's not clear that technology will be able to get us all the way to the green curve, and if so, when. But I think we can certainly aim to get closer and closer to that side of the continuum. Now, the question that always gets asked now is, if this is so great and we can solve potentially the Benjamin Bloom problem, does that mean that universities should go defunct? And there is a quote that's actually traditionally attributed to Mark Twain, but I've discovered recently is not due to Mark Twain, which is that college is a place where professors' lecture notes go straight to the students' lecture notes without passing through the brains of either. Now, that's one, I think, very pessimistic view of a college education, and I think it's more of a condemnation of a big lecture as opposed to actual college. And when I think of what college ought to be, I want to go even further back to Plutarch, which is who said that the mind is not a vessel that needs filling, but wood that needs igniting. And lectures are really intended to fill our students' minds with content. But maybe one of the things that we should do more of is try and use the time in the classroom to ignite their minds with passion for their discipline, critical thinking skills, and so on. And so one of the primary goals of this whole endeavor, and in fact, for me, the one that started me off on this whole trajectory 4 years ago or so, is that by moving lecturing out of the classroom, we can actually do other stuff in the class, such as active learning. So here is a very, I think, inspiring result from Nobel Prize-winning physicist Carl Wyman, who was on the faculty at the University of British Columbia. And he published in Science 2011 a paper that studied a large enrollment physics class with 270 students in the case population, the control population. And he demonstrated that the lecture-based class, which are the bars on the left, are considerably worse in terms of every single metric, or rather that the active learning population, which are the bars on the right, are considerably better in attendance, in engagement and in student learning than a standard lecture. And this is a performance, learning is measured by performance on a standard test, going from 41% to 74%. And this is really a suggestion, a very strong piece of evidence in favor of shifting much more of our instruction to this form, which is also supported by a variety of other results, like Eric Mazur from Harvard has demonstrated this, as have many others. So teaching this way is hard, I can tell you, because I've been doing it. It's not the same as standing here and orating and giving the same lecture that you've given every year for the past 15 years. It's much harder than that, because you have to actually interact with your students and let the lecture go wherever it may, and that's really challenging. But what are some of the things that you can do in that kind of a format? You can do just-in-time teaching, where you look at the mistakes that your students made in their homework the last week, which you have immediately graded because of all the auto-grading capability, and spend time clarifying whatever it was that the students didn't get instead of dwelling on the stuff that they did. You can do real-world case studies, which are incredibly inspiring to students for two reasons. First, because they show that some of the more theoretical content that you're teaching is actually applicable. And second, because it illustrates, in many cases, some of the design constraints that occur when the rubber hits the road. That is, what are some of the compromises you have to make when you're using these methods in practice? And you can do a lot of that kind of team problem solving that Carl Wyman, for example, has demonstrated as being so effective in his work. Okay, so I'm going to end now with the final slide that goes all the way back to the beginning of the talk, which is the universal access to education and why we should care. And this is my sort of, highfalutin, big vision slide, so please forgive me if it's a little bit sappy. So what would the world get if you could provide free access to everyone to this kind of high-quality education that until now has been available only to a small sliver of the world's population who happen to be enrolled in an institution such as Princeton? Well, first of all, education is the great equalizer. And by providing this kind of education to everyone, you let anyone, no matter their geographic or financial circumstances, assuming they have an internet connection, which admittedly is an issue, with the ability, if they have the skills and the motivation, to make a better life for themselves and their families. The second is that it allows lifelong learning. For many of us, maybe not us in this room, but for a lot of people, learning ends when we finish college, or sometimes when we finish high school. And the world around us is moving far too fast now for the stuff that we learned in college 15 or 30 years ago to still be enough to sustain us as educated members of society. And this kind of content that's out there is an opportunity for anyone who's curious to find out more about a topic, whether it's just because they're curious or whether it's because they want to somehow use that to change their lives. That opportunity is then going to be open to them. And finally, you don't know where the next genius is going to be. Maybe there is an Albert Einstein hiding in Mongolia or in Ghana. And if you give that person access to education, they might invent something that will be really cool and make the world a better place for everyone. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions, and Clayton Marsh, who's really, as I said earlier, been instrumental in bringing this to Princeton, is also here to ask questions. So I would ask that you come up to the mics, though, because it's very hard to hear if you don't. Were you waiting in line? No. Okay, we'll start over here.
Hey, Professor Koller. Thank you very much for coming all the way down here to talk to us. And say hi to my classmate, Pang Wei, back at Coursera for me.
Pang Wei is awesome.
Yeah, he's an awesome guy. I was just wondering whether you could tell us a bit more about the potential obstacles and the potential pushes that the government could give to you. Namely, firstly, what are some of the regulatory risks facing that Coursera might face, be it copyright infringement, whatever you guys might face? And secondly, how can the government and how can regulators better help Coursera accomplish its mission?
That's a very interesting question, and there are several answers to that. So First, there is the issue of copyright permissions, and that's one that we've definitely spent a lot of effort dealing with. This is a complicated one because of several reasons. First, because it's uncharted territory in many ways in terms of legal precedent, what's fair use and what's not fair use in this area of free online teaching, and there aren't any clear-cut answers, and so people are guessing, and you're kind of hoping that if you guess, if you guess too conservatively, it becomes too painful to do. If you guess too liberally, you become at risk of getting sued by the publishers, and so that's one of the challenges. A second challenge is that publishers have been doing business in the same way for many, many years, and it's difficult for them to make this transition to what is a very different world that we're now finding ourselves in. And so having that conversation with publishers with a very well-established business model is a challenge and something that we needed to deal with. So that's one of the challenges. Another one that you will read about tomorrow in the Chronicle of Higher Education is the regulatory ones. So a few months ago in July, we got a cease and desist from the state of Minnesota saying that they cannot allow us to offer free online content to students of the state of Minnesota without having gone through a whole set of regulatory sort of obstacles that they needed us to go through. And furthermore, it's not we who needed to do that, it's every single one of our 33 partner universities needed to do that.
You didn't tell me that.
I didn't tell you that. So our compromise with the state of Minnesota, as you will read tomorrow in the Chronicle of Higher Education, is that currently, if you scroll all the way to the bottom of the terms of service, there is a little clause that says that if you're a resident of the state of Minnesota, you are committing to the fact, you're attesting to the fact that you did half the course while residing outside the state. And we have a letter, so it's okay, Clayton, that says that this is okay. Now, this was an interesting situation for us because the other option that we had at that point in time was just to block the state of Minnesota altogether, which would obviously have been a bad solution for the residents of the state of Minnesota. But anyway, it was an interesting situation, and if you're asking what regulators can do to make life better for efforts such as this, is first of all, to just let them be, would be a good start. And yeah, I think that's really the biggest thing they could do, just to let us be. I don't know, do you want to jump in here, Clayton?
I think the copyright issues are very interesting. Our fair use exemption under the Copyright Act will certainly be put to some new tests. A lot that we do here on campus under the face-to-face teaching exemption that exemption isn't necessarily available to us when we go out into an online space. And of course, there's a much greater degree of visibility. So clearly, we need to be careful, proceed cautiously as we ease into this to this much bigger classroom. So I think that will be very interesting.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Who pays? What is the business model, and how is this going to be sustained in the future? We know that anything free has a cost at some point.
Of course. So there are costs at this point on two sides. The universities, and I'll leave Clayton to get into the details if necessary, pay the cost of producing the content. And that was a considered decision on our part because we wanted content production to stay on the university side so that the IP rests on the university side. So the university/instructor retain all rights to the IP. There are costs on our side that have to do both with the not inconsiderable cost of developing this very complicated platform, as well as with the ever-growing, with 1.6 million students, costs to hosting and streaming the content, which are also not inconsiderable. And so there are costs and they will need to be paid. We have some ideas on the business model, which have as yet not been implemented. So at this point, it's very speculative, and we hope they'll work, because if it doesn't, then we're going to crash and burn, which would be sad. The two biggest ideas that we have explored so far, or at least discussed and started to put in place, are first the issue of certification, so that even though the content is free, so that students around the world who don't even have a credit card can still have the ability to learn, if they're going to get some kind of certificate that allows them to get a better job, or in some parts of the world, they've even gotten college credit for our courses. So some universities are starting to articulate our courses into their program. That seems reasonable enough for us to charge a modest amount for that, so that, and that can, even though it's optional, because of the large number of students that we have, that could be enough to sustain the effort. And I should say in this regard that Princeton is not doing certificates, so just to sort of, not to get myself in trouble. And then the other one that I think is promising is working with employers to help facilitate introductions to skilled employees, because although there is a lot of unemployment out there, there's also large numbers of jobs that are going unfilled because of a skills gap. And employers are, this is a very nice population to offer to employers, because not only are these often educated people, they're people who've demonstrated a motivation to learn more, and be motivated and able to deal with this kind of challenging material. And furthermore, we can provide the employers with very detailed information about these students, their performance in assessments, as well as how cooperative they were in answering questions on the discussion forum, which is a very useful skill in the 21st century workplace. Now this, of course, will be by student opt-in only, so only students who chose to participate in this. But when that happens, it's a win-win for everyone, for the employers and for the students, and it's a way for employers to help pay for this.
And I should add that Daphne and Coursera have been very accommodating as partners, and have given us a lot of flexibility to get comfortable as we ease into this exploration, of online learning and its potential to enhance teaching and learning on this campus, and also to find ways for us to make our content more widely available. As Daphne mentioned, we have taken a very conservative approach to the issue of credentialing and certification. Right now, all of the offerings from Princeton University on Coursera are there for students to take or leave, to use for their benefit, but we do not issue any kind of statement or certification. And we are very much in control of whatever monetization strategy Coursera may want to pursue with respect to our offerings. And I should also add that David Dobkin has convened a faculty committee that is looking into these questions and issues around monetization to kind of establish some baselines and make recommendations for consideration in the future. So we're still at a very early stage. It's unclear where all of this is going, and I have to say Coursera has been a great partner in giving us the flexibility to get comfortable with it on our own terms.
Hi, first I'd just like to say thank you so much for building this excellent tool. I'm on my 12th Coursera class and they've all been excellent. So my question has to do with brand. Certainly Princeton and Stanford are two universities that by attracting the very best professors and having the very hardest classes, they attract the best students, and that keeps their public image of legitimacy very high. And when I found Coursera, and it had about 7 to 9 universities, they were all the very highest quality universities. That was one of the things that was very attractive to me about it. And now there's 33 universities, which are all excellent universities, but I start to see some that I don't recognize as much. And I start to see classes on topics that we don't have at Princeton, like how to take care of horses, for example, which, while that's a very useful subject in various different places in the world, I was just wondering, is the direction that Coursera is headed in any subject that can be learned, no matter who is teaching it or where it's coming from? So, for example, many of the certifications are just signed by the professor themselves. What if I had content that was unique, but I'm not a professor? I'm sure no one cares about getting a certificate signed by me. I was just wondering about the direction that Coursera plans to take in terms of which universities it lets in and how it manages courses that it wants to be taught from different institutions that maybe cover the same material.
Okay, so that's a very good question. Let me start with the care and feeding of horses and some of the other courses that you mentioned. That is actually from one of the world's best veterinary schools, and veterinary is a highly respected academic discipline. And I personally think that if a topic is an academic discipline that actually gives you an academic credential at the end, then I'm comfortable with it being on Coursera, even if it's not taught at Princeton. And I would point out that Princeton is one of the institutions that doesn't have, for example, any professional schools, except for the Woodrow Wilson School. But there's no business school, there's no medical school, there's no dental school, there's a whole range of professional education disciplines that are highly respected and exist in most of the top tier schools around the world that are not represented here, and that's okay because Princeton is a unique institution that has its own philosophy about things, but that doesn't make them any less respectable for that. As to the more general question, we are by charter, by contract in fact, with Princeton and our other partner universities restricted to only offering academic content from the top universities. The definition of what's top is different in different perceptions. I would say that while very few institutions admittedly are held in the same high regard as places like Princeton and Stanford, that's a tiny, tiny handful of institutions. There are among the institutions that are currently there and a few others, a great wealth of courses, including some of the ones that you mentioned and others that are of tremendous value and tremendous quality. And I think that students around the world benefit from having access to that breadth of content, which is why for me, as long as it is a top tier institution, even if it's not quite as, top 5 as Princeton might be, but still top enough that the quality of the instruction is really outstanding, I think that the world gains from having that.
I also want to thank you for such a great initiative. I'm taking Coursera, 2 classes. I first took it just to find out what it is, and then I got hooked because it's just so good. My question is, and maybe it is out of scope for Coursera, but when you look around the world and you show the globe, the 2 classes that I take are so global, from Nepal, from Brazil, and so on. But I can't help but think that in many places in the world, there are a lot of young people who do not have access to even basic education, like primary school and secondary schools, or basic marketable skills training. And they are all in remote villages, but they have electricity, everybody have a cell phone. Is there a plan or a vision that a model like this could be adapted, maybe in some kind of a partnership with the local government, so that we could really materialize that dream of education for all?
So I think that is a truly compelling vision. And there's really 2 parts, I think, to the question. You basically were talking about the subset of villages that actually have electricity and cell phones for everyone. There's also large numbers of villages in parts of the world that have no electricity or cell phones, and so there's the whole question of how do you even build sufficient infrastructure so that people have the ability to access the content, whether it's devices or bandwidth. And I think that is a truly huge question, because in this information age, people who are cut off from access to the internet in all of its purposes are at a significant disadvantage. That clearly is outside the scope of what we as an organization can hope to achieve, at least in the near future. But I think it's definitely something that we are engaging with governments and NGOs, as well as commercial companies, to try and see whether one can provide better infrastructure, at least, for example, lower cost or even free bandwidth to people who are accessing educational content as opposed to, shopping or watching movies or something. And so that would be one direction that we would like to go in, and that would be in partnership with other organizations. Now, the second half of your question is about primary and secondary education. And I completely agree with you that in many parts of the world, that is an even more acute need than the tertiary education that we're currently providing. Although I would argue that for getting a good living in this new economy that we find ourselves in, a secondary education is usually not enough, and one often needs more than that. But nevertheless, I agree you can't get to the tertiary until you do the primary and secondary. It's not clear that what we have is the right solution right now for primary education. You could argue that for secondary education, people who, 15, 16 years old, the kind of, videos with quizzes and homeworks and stuff, they're mature enough to just, get with the program and do it. I don't know that you could put a 7-year-old or 5-year-old next to a computer with this kind of interaction and get them engaged and have this be a successful learning experience for them. There's so much work that's being done right now in constructing different games and different sort of strategies for getting 5-year-olds or 7-year-olds to learn addition and multiplication and fractions down the line in a way that makes it more comprehensible to them via games. And that's a whole industry in and of itself. And so I think ultimately it might be possible to take some of that work and feed it into our platform as kind of extensions, and that would make it more fun and useful for a primary school child. But right now, I don't think that what we have is the right, it seems like a square peg in a round hole in some ways.
Okay, I see 2 people coming down, and these will be the last 2, and then we're going to let our guests leave.
I'm Dipendra. I'm from Nepal, and I fortunately tend to here because of the Coursera. So in this context, what I would like to ask is, what are the possibilities that you are going to give your system to the countries, especially developing countries, and they can use, they can localize your system and use to teach more local courses. For example, my country has 13 different languages apart from the main Nepali language that we speak. So is there any possibility that we can take this big system into the local context as well? Has Coursera ever thought on that direction?
I think the answer ultimately is yes, that we would be able to give more institutions the ability to use the platform to host their own teaching content. This is particularly valuable, as you say, when there's a need for content in other languages. We're actually making a concerted effort right now to put up content in other languages. So we're starting to offer now our first courses in French, and we hope to expand beyond that into at least the major languages. But you're right that that's not going to cover the 13 languages in Nepal, and we're going to need to do something to allow local institutions to provide content. Right now, we're just not geared in terms of capacity to support that. As it is, we've grown a lot faster than we had expected, and we're kind of just trying to, shore up the foundations of a system that was never intended to have 1.6 million students less than 7 months after it was written the first time. So it's going to take us a little bit of time before we can broaden support to a much larger set of institutions.
The last word.
So that was good timing for my question, which is going to be about language learning. So, and just seeing how this tool does compete sort of pretty directly with some of the other software-based language learning, whether it's Rosetta Stone or some others that have used this type of technology. And for me, I would be very interested in using it to learn a language and then maybe be able to Skype with someone where that's their native language and to be doing that in about history or something that that's something I think the classroom does really poorly, is providing that space for speaking. So would love to hear your vision for language learning, not just about content being in that language, but actually teaching those languages and what that would look like.
So I think you're absolutely right that language learning is very well suited to an online platform. And as you've already mentioned, that there are some organizations, companies out there that do that. We currently are taking whatever content our universities are giving us, and we have not yet been offered a language course, although actually in my first visit to Princeton, we almost, but didn't quite, get a class teaching Gez, which I'm sure you've never heard of. I hadn't either. It's ancient Ethiopian, which is a really useful day-to-day skill, but we would have been happy to have that, but it fell through for other reasons.
That was our lead offering.
Yes. we were devastated when that didn't, pan out. But no, it would have been really fun actually to try out a language course, and so yeah, I think it would be a really interesting direction. I don't know, to be honest, how well it would perform relative to the Rosetta Stones and such of the world, because we haven't tried it and we haven't really done a face-to-face whatever comparison. So I think it'll be. But you're right, it's a direction that we could and might end up going in, depending on whether Clayton offers us another class in some interesting language.
Throwing them one at a time.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for coming. This is really an interesting